I'm so happy to see so many of you joining today. We are very excited about this session. We are today doing the second part of our two-part series called Unpacking Policy, where we dive into the intersection of fashion and politics, and we also examine the historical perspectives and future trajectories of European textiles-related policies. It's the first session took place in March. So if you haven't seen it, you can go online on our GFA website to rewatch or watch it today after this session. It's a big year in politics this year for the fashion industry and beyond. We have had the European Parliament election, and we have an upcoming US election as well soon. So there's a lot to talk about. And today we have a lineup of amazing speakers joining us. We are going to talk more about the EU focus. So I'm looking so much forward to introducing them in a minute. Our moderator today is my dear colleague, Maria Luisa, and she's the Public Affairs Director at Global Fashion Agenda. And if you have any questions today, feel free to write them in the Q&A. We have a Q&A session by the end of our session. So first we will have a discussion. And if any question pops into your mind whilst we are discussing with the speakers, then just write it in the Q&A and we'll try to answer it by the end of the session. And that's all for me for now. I'm so happy to say hello to Maria Luisa.
All right, I'll get the mic back on. Hopefully you can hear me. All right. And thank you, Maria. A warm welcome to everyone from me as well. And I would be curious to hear from you in the chat who watched part one of this masterclass, the one that we held in March. So please just drop a yes or a no in the chat so that we know. Yes, no, okay, there's a bit of everything. So for the yes who want to rewatch it and for the no's who want to watch it, it's on our website. Our colleagues will put the link in there so that you can access it and watch the amazing content that we had back then. What happened back then? So we basically had a representative from the European Commission, DG GROW. We had H&M Group, and we had a representative from FESI, the European Federation of the Sporting Goods Industries. And what did we discuss? Well, it was extremely rich. So again, please go and watch the full thing. But some of our key takeaways are in the slide that you should be seeing in your screens right now. The first thing that we saw is something that now seems obvious, right? That fashion went from being completely unregulated to highly regulated. Then we discussed a lot about legislation being an opportunity to drive positive change. And back then, our speakers discussed the fact that the next phase is implementation. Let's see what our panelists today have to say. Also back then, it was before the European elections, so our panelists predicted that sustainability would stay on top of the agenda after the EU elections. And last but not least, an amazing quote from our representative from the Commission back then, Antonio de Sousa Maya, saying there is no green industry without an industry. All right, but a lot has happened since then. What has happened? So first of all, we had the European elections back in June. Then we had the EU Council Summit, where the EU heads of state discussed the leadership positions for the next 5 years. Then moving on to July, where we found out that Ursula von der Leyen was re-elected as president of the European Commission. And the week after, the members of the European Parliament held the first committee meeting setting the legislative work for the new term. And then another important milestone happened actually last week on the 30th of August, which was the deadline for national governments to propose commissioners. All right, Nothing new in this slide, of course, because a lot has been said and analyzed since the election. So this is just a very quick takeaway from the main conclusions from the elections. First of all, shift to the right. There was a clear far-right gains, but not a dominance. Renew and the Greens suffered significant seat losses. Let's see later on with Rasmus what that means. There's a fragmentation that will, of course, necessitate coalition building, with the EPP needing to form alliances to pass legislation. And the European Parliament elections also had a huge impact on national politics, as you all know, with, for instance, in France, President Macron calling for anticipated elections. All right, let's move on to the re-election and new appointments of EU top jobs. So here you see two familiar faces, right? You have Ursula von der Leyen, who will remain at the head of the EU Commission, and you have Roberta Metsola staying at the head of the European Parliament. But we also have new faces. So Charles Michel will be replaced by Antonio Costa at the head of the EU Council, and then Josep Borrell will also be replaced by Kaja Kallas, yes, as High Representative of the EU for Foreign Affairs and Security Policy. One last piece of information for me, the new College of Commissioners. So, of course, this is not set, right? But if these names are approved, these are 5 faces that we will hear a lot from, because those are the portfolios that are more likely to impact the textile sector. So who do we have here? We have, first of all, the Spanish Teresa Rivera for the Green Deal portfolio. Then we have Thierry Breton, who would remain as head of internal market. Jessica Roswell from Sweden would be leading on competitiveness and climate. The current EVP, Maros Sefcovic, would be leading on industry and energy. And then Dan Jorgensen from Denmark, and current global climate minister, would be leading on the Green Deal and climate portfolio. So on the process, these are the faces that have been proposed by their government, but on the 16th to 19th of September, they will be presented and there will be exchanges. Then in October, end October, there should be a plenary vote to approve the entire College of Commissioners. Following which, in November, December, we should expect mission letters from Ursula von der Leyen, who will then outline the college responsibilities and the priorities for the term. Then last December, January, again, estimate, who knows what will happen and who knows what will happen in the previous steps of this image. The European Commission will release its program for 2025. All right, that was it from me. And now let me introduce you to our fantastic panelists for today. So first of all, we have Rasmus Nordqvist. Hi, Rasmus. Welcome. Rasmus is a Danish member of the European Parliament, representing the Greens European Free Alliance. And before entering politics, Rasmus was, interestingly enough, working in the fashion industry, where he worked as a designer and a consultant. His background in sustainability strongly influences his work in the European Parliament, where he advocates for environmental and social justice issues. Thank you, Rasmus, for being with us. Then we have Pascal Moreau, founder with Ohana Public Affairs. Pascal brings over 16 years experience in public affairs, in-house and within industry associations. And Pascal has always focused on sustainability policies, gaining an understanding of various sectors. Ohana is a boutique public affairs consultancy specialized in sustainability and dedicated to making the EU's policies and processes easy to understand and actionable within organizations. Thank you so much for being with us, Pascal. And last but certainly not least, we have Tim McPhee, spokesperson for climate action and energy at the European Commission. Tim has worked for almost 20 years in Brussels, first in the private sector, and then for 10 years in the Commission spokesperson service, including as spokesperson for climate and energy policies for the past 5 years. Great to have you here with us, Tim. All right, let's get started. Let us take the deck out so that we can see each other better. And let's kick off by hearing our panelists' first impressions on the new political context. Reminder, please post your questions throughout the session. We will take them at the end, but great if you can just drop them in there as they come so that you don't forget them, and we will be trying to regroup them and trying to address as many as possible. All right, Pascal, let me start with you. So Ohana works with different organizations active in the textiles field. How do you answer when these organizations ask you what will be different following the EU elections? What are, let's say, the top 3 changes?
Yeah, thanks, Maria-Lisa, and hi, everyone. Super happy to be with you all. So I think it's a kind reminder for everybody is to keep in mind that engaging with EU policymakers is quite new for our industry. It's been new for the past mandate. So we are newbies in Brussels. It's been the past 5 years, meaning that with the new mandate, we're entering a new phase. And that's part of the first change that I want to highlight for our industry is that we are now working on the legacy from the textile strategy, meaning all the pieces of legislation that the European Commission has put on the table. Still, some are being discussed within the Parliament and with the member states. But at the same time, our industry needs to also be a thought leader. So being part of the discussion on what would be the next priorities for the mandate, engaging with new MEPs such as Rasmus. So that's really quite a big change for our industry because we're not used to that. I know a lot of civil society, industry association, or individual companies have amazing public affairs experts, but for the new ones on the block, it's actually you need to think of, okay, this is what we need to influence in the pipeline. So legislation that are going through technical pieces, such as the eco-design legislation, but I would come back into that. But also, what do we want to have as a next priority? That competitiveness is big for the next mandate. There is also Green Deal. How do, we don't want maybe this to be dropped. Chemical circular economy is still high on the agenda. So how our industry from a civil society on a pure industry perspective wants to engage. The second change, I would say, is the new forces in the Parliament, as you mentioned. There are new dynamics within the European Parliament. So as an industry, you need to think of new narrative. So before Green Deal was the big one, now it might shift to competition. But if sustainability is really key and really important for you, how are you matching the two, for example, for competition and Green Deal? Also, you will have to create new coalition when you want to engage. So now we saw that the third party is not Renew, it's the far right. So meaning that you will have to engage with a broader community and along the parties. And it's one of the questions also our clients are asking is how to engage with the different forces that have more now seats. And that I would say it's up to everybody to answer that. And then the third change is what we've seen is kind of the drop in priority within maybe the Commission, and I'm sure Tim will come back on that, but also member states about the Green Deal. So how do we approach this? It's a shift approach going into more implementation. So how do we ensure that the legislation that have been in the pipeline actually are, written and implemented in the safe way to really push the needle and ensure also the level playing field. So there's still a lot to be done with the legislation in the pipeline, but I think it's something also that maybe the industry needs to massage and take into account that big shift from last mandate, Green Deal, big top priority, and now it's coming into competition.
Yeah, absolutely. Thank you so much, Pascal. And so interesting to think where we were in the beginning of the previous mandate, right? When we think of 2019, of course, this is new for the industry. I would say a bit less new, can we say, than 5 years ago, for sure. But yeah, thank you so much. I think those are three great takeaways. Rasmus, congratulations on your election. So as we said, the European Parliament is now set, 720 MEPs in place for the next mandate. You are a member of the Greens EFA party and a member also of the ENVI committee, being the one in charge for the environment, public health and food safety. We want to know all the internal secrets. So tell us, Renew and the Greens suffered significant seat losses, as we saw. So what are the consequences first? That's the first question. And I would also be very curious to hear if the ENVI committee already has a work program, and if you already have an idea on the main dossiers impacting textiles.
Yes, hello, and thank you. I mean, still totally new and just back from holiday here in Brussels. Yes, I mean, the result of the election, I mean, you know it. Yes, we lost seats, Renew lost some seats, and we saw a bigger right wing, not just the extreme right, but also EPP. And the new reality in the parliament is there's no majority without EPP, the Conservative Party. So where before we have been parties who have been able to push a lot of these agendas because we have been able to create alternative majorities, we are in a different situation. And for sure, I mean, many people just before the election and after the election actually wrote it as being, okay, it's the end of the Green Deal, end of green action. Now we're just going to see implementation and all the businesses can go back to sleep and do what they have done for centuries now. And I'm happy to say that actually what we saw after the election, first of all, the extreme right not gaining as many seats as was predicted, but also with the political guidelines from Ursula von der Leyen, which was presented before the vote, the 18th of July. It's clear that Madame von der Leyen will continue her work with the Green Deal. It was very clear that because she needed a bigger group of parties behind her to get the majority for her, she could not just rely on Renew, EPP, and the Socialist. She needed a fourth party, and that party became the Greens because of her guidelines. That said, the coming 5 years is going to be really tough if you are focusing on sustainability in legislation. If you actually want serious action and not just talk, it's going to be an uphill battle, but something we of course take up with pride and all the energy we always have with the Greens. Yes, I'm in the committee, looking much forward to work on these issues. Again, I've been sitting 2 times in the Danish Parliament, working on also many of these topics, especially also on circular economy. We don't have as such work programs and everything in place because also, I mean, a lot is waiting on the commission to be presented, mission letters and all this. But we know already there is a lot coming the next 5 years. I mean, it's not going to be a total walk in the park for the fashion and textile industry. I mean, there's first of all, yes, implementation, but there's also things to be reviewed where at least I can see we could push in some much needed green action for the industry. Because we have to remember, even with what has been decided in the last 5 years, there's a long way to go. I mean, when we look at circularity in the fashion and textile business, it's still ridiculously low. And much of what we actually see when it comes to that is downcycling of drinking bottles and so forth. So we have a lot to do still. And luckily enough, there is a lot of these different negotiations that have to be reopened. Both the carbon border mechanism, we could put some textiles in there. There's also on the eco-design, as Pascal was mentioning. And then there is negotiation, that's trilogue negotiations that will start up, especially I think about the textile aspects of the waste framework. It's going to be negotiated in trilogues this fall, I think.
Yeah, absolutely, Erasmus. Thank you so much for advancing already some of the things that will happen. We'll go a bit deeper into some of the dossiers that will be passed into the current parliament. But yeah, I love what you said about the serious action and not just talk, right? And definitely not a walk in the park, even though a lot was done, a lot remains. Yeah, thank you so much for that clear overview. All right, Tim, what about the Commission? Let's say, father of the Green Deal, Frans Timmermans, already left the Commission ahead of the end of the last mandate. We now know that Commissioner Sinkevičius, one of the main actors also advocating for sustainable textiles, is now at the European Parliament. How are those changes and others expected to impact the ecosystem of players active on textiles?
Yeah, thanks, Maria-Louisa, and hi to everyone. Thanks so much for the invitation. Yeah, as you say, we've already seen some changes in this commission with the departures of the Executive Vice President Timmermans and Commissioner Sinkevičius. But their roles, their responsibilities have been taken over now by the new Vice President who's covering the Green Deal, which is Maroš Šefčovič. He was on one of your slides earlier. And of course, Commissioner Breton is still here as well, in charge of industry and internal market. And I think it's important to remember that we still have at least 2 months ahead of us with this commission. I know a lot of the people online have a very international perspective and might well be looking towards the COP, whether that's the biodiversity or the climate COP coming up later this year, the UN General Assembly, where the Commission is always very active as well, with lots of events, and there'll be a lot of focus on climate and environmental issues there, and energy as well. So we're not finished yet. I think that's one important thing to say. So the people that you've been working with over the next few years will still be your interlocutors for the next couple of months. But then looking forward, as you say, you set it out a little bit in your slides at the beginning. We're now going into the real starting blocks of this next commission. We have nominations. President von der Leyen has received at least one name from every government now, and she is working on putting together her team of commissioners. We might still see a couple of changes in those names. We know that she is seeing if it's possible to increase the number of female candidates for the commission, which is currently lower than it is in the current mandate. So that might evolve. And then she needs to decide which portfolios each commissioner is going to get, and she will assign those. My guess would be in the next week or 2 weeks, depending on how those conversations go with the new commissioners and with the capitals as well. And then she will be assigning responsibilities and giving the commissioners basically their job description. And I think what you will see is an element of continuity. I think you will see very many of the same job titles that you've seen until now. There will be a commissioner responsible for the climate, for energy, for environment, but there will be some changes. She's already said that there will be a commissioner who will deal with fisheries and oceans specifically, which was dealt with together with the environment portfolio before. So you might see a little bit of a change on that side of things. Sorry, I've got my phone ringing. And I think as well, what you will see is a bit of a merging in the next commission. The president has already set out the Clean Industrial Deal as her focus, as the continuation of the Green Deal, and of her focus on competitiveness, a strong European industry with sustainability at its core. So I think the interesting thing will be to see what she does at kind of vice president level, and to see where the balance of power is between the more, I would say, the green side of the house and then the industrial side of the house. And I think what you will see is the president trying to bring those things more closely together. So as I say, at this stage, I can't give you a list of names and who's going to be responsible for what job. You've obviously, Maria-Louisa and the team, done some research, looked at the backgrounds of several of the incoming commissioners, and I think it's fair to say that there's a good chance of those that you've identified working broadly in the area of the green transition, climate, industrial files. But yeah, we'll see in the next couple of weeks exactly who gets what and and how they piece together, how they work together.
Yeah, indeed. Thank you, Tim. Yeah, it's a very interesting moment in which this masterclass takes place, right? Because we hear names, but of course it's not confirmed. So thanks for mentioning that again. And for our audience following these topics more from the distance, please bear in mind that those names have not been confirmed, right? This information that we got from the media. All right, Tim, let's actually stay with you because we have discussed the players, but I would love to hear more on the content. Of course, we don't have much here to play with. We basically have Ursula von der Leyen's re-election speech that we have analyzed. There's a few European Commission guidelines. What can you tell us about the European Commission's priorities when it comes to policies impacting textiles?
Yeah, I think as you say, we haven't got the whole work plan for the next 12 months or even the next 5 years. But what we do have is a good sense of the political framing of this next mandate. Some of those following online will have read the political guidelines which President von der Leyen presented in July. This is the basis of her re-election by the European Parliament. So I think it's well worth having a look through those, because you will get a sense of the way she will approach the files, even if we don't have the details at this stage. So I think what's obviously very high on her list of priorities is bringing together the Green Deal and healthy industrial base in Europe. She mentions sustainability, prosperity, competitiveness, fairness. So I think everything will be seen through that lens, a little bit how the industry will interact with the Commission and Parliament going forward. I just wanted to pick out a few interesting things that I noticed, kind of buzzwords and phrases from her political guidance, which I think are interesting as well for the industry. One thing that she says very much upfront is we've seen the dangers of dependencies. So the president very much sees the Europe's security challenges, economic challenges that have come through the COVID crisis, seeing how we dealt with the issue of vaccine procurement. Of course, with Russia's invasion of Ukraine, you've seen this big dependency on one energy supplier. And I think you will see more and more a focus on sustainable supply chains, on boosting European industry, domestic production, and domestic supply chains, and making sure that there are partnerships with other regions, other countries around the world, which put Europe in a very kind of solid, sustainable place where our industries will not be disrupted. So I would certainly say that that's going to be an important and interesting issue for this industry to follow. And then, of course, there's big policies which you've been looking at already, in traceability of materials, labor issues. I think they will remain very much on the agenda as well. And then, yeah, I think the clean industrial deal has obviously been presented by President von der Leyen as her big ticket issue, which for me is a continuation of the Green Deal and its objectives, in a way under a different name and perhaps with a different orientation. I would say in the previous 5 years, the president said number one priority is climate and it will be good for jobs. And I think what she's saying now is number one priority is jobs and industry, and we will do that in a way that's good for the climate and the planet. So I think those two issues have been close together in the past 5 years and will be close together in the next 5 years as well. Couple of other things just to mention. She focuses a lot on circularity as well in her political guidelines. Water resilience is another issue which has been mentioned again. Obviously, something for the industry to bear in mind, can be very water intensive. And then just one other thing that I wanted to mention as well. She mentions the impact of our policies on our relationships with third countries. I think this is also primarily focused on the Green Deal. things like our deforestation regulation, a new attention to the impacts on global trade, on our partnerships, of the way we do domestic climate and environmental legislation.
Amazing, Tim. Thank you so much. I think some of our colleagues have also put the link to the guidelines that you mentioned. So thank you so much for that. Then you can all access the points that that Tim is mentioning. But thank you so much. That gives a great overview. And I love how you phrase the number one from climate to industry, and now the same, but the other way around. Yeah, thank you so much for that, Tim. Pascal, yeah, Rasmus also mentioned some of the files that will be going into this next mandate. Yeah, basically some were passed before the elections, others will continue being discussed under the new mandate. Rasmus mentioned the revision of the Waste Framework Directive. There's a lot going on. Can you tell us which are the main ones that you will be focusing on for your clients?
Yeah, sure. Thanks a lot. And as you could hear, everybody from Teams and Rasmus inputs, it would be really busy times ahead. We won't be bored for sure. Maybe what I would like to unpack is, as you mentioned, Maria Luisa, is like what comes from the previous mandate, so 2019, 2024, and maybe building a bit on what Tim has mentioned in a second stage of my answer. What it's important to keep in mind from the previous mandate, there are big pieces of legislation that are really key for the industry, for the textile industry, that are still under discussion. So one that is really at the beginning, it's the textile labeling regulation. So how, like those long labels that you have in your garments, that's actually being reviewed at the moment. We are waiting for the European Commission to come up with the proposals or the draft legislation, and so that it's expected for the end of this year, early next year, and then the full process of discussing it within the Parliament with member state is coming. So this can have a massive impact on what Tim was mentioning, traceability, for example, but also how you communicate to your consumer on the label, but also digitally. So that would be a big piece. Other pieces that have been mentioned and are quite advanced, but are still under negotiation, is the one that Rasmus mentioned, the Waste Framework Directive, meaning that it will develop the framework for member states, so the national level, how to define collection and recycling infrastructure, fees, etc., on companies that sell the product in Europe. So that will also have massive impact. And for those who don't know what trilogue means, it's like the final discussions between all three institutions that will basically, after that, it will be the final legislation, but then still there will be some technical discussions like secondary legislation to explain exactly what all the concepts will mean. So much more is coming on this piece of legislation. Green claim is not specific to our industry, but it's massive. It's basically for those that are on the call, how you would be able to communicate about the environmental specification of your product to your consumer. So that's also, it's coming, same approach as for the Waste Framework Directive, trilogues or final discussions. And then there would be some technical discussion happening to flesh it up. And for sure, the famous eco-design regulation. So if you hear about ESPR, that's the piece of legislation you should be not worried maybe, but very interested in, because now we are actually discussing with the Commission all the technical product requirements. So what means recycled content, how you define this, what are the key requirements, same for durability, recyclability. So here it's a long-term process. It's still happening this year and next year, and will really define what are the minimum requirements for your product to be accepted in the EU. So that I would say it's a key one to, if you don't have the bandwidth to engage, at least to monitor, because if you don't comply, well, you cannot access the market. And linked to this is the famous digital product passport, And it's back to what Tim was saying about traceability. You will have to input your data in this tool, and it's for suppliers, for brands, but also for recyclers. So it's to input the information, and this information, depending on the requirements, will be disclosed to authorities, to recyclers, but also to consumers. So again, massive piece. I saw in the Q&A, there were some questions about forced labor and due diligence. This is also happening. The additional engagement is needed because there would be guidelines around those two pieces of legislation, what it means for our industry. So there would be some specific guidelines for our industry. It's more a discussion with the Commission, but I'm pretty sure the European Parliament will try to influence. If you want to be a bit more in tune of what all those pieces of legislation are, at OANA, we have a blog trying to make it easier to understand. I will put the link there, but it's usually seen as quite a nice source of information. And now so that's just what we have from the past mandate. And now we're getting into the new mandate. And there are big pieces that are coming up that have been announced in the famous political guidelines from Ms. von der Leyen. It's the Circular Economy Act that has actually, I would say, it's a win from civil society that were calling for resources management legislation, and textile is mentioned there. Exactly as Tim was mentioning, we don't know what's in there, but it will be important for us. The chemical package with the revision of the REACH regulation, the PFAS restriction. So for those who don't know, PFAS is substances that usually is used for water repellent and oil repellent, and is a long-lasting one. And for those that work in, with governments, the revision of public procurement directive will be also important, because our industry is not only fashion and direct consumer, but there's also the whole side towards national governments. And there are much more topics that could be of interest. For example, as Tim mentioned, the international dimension, but also investment. What is green investment for our industry? Maybe it's something that we will be put on the table. And gender equality is really important in our industry, because women are actually part of, it's the main workforce. I know the strategy will focus on the EU, but maybe there might be an additional opportunity to discuss what it means for our industry. And climate adaptation plans, intergenerational dialogue, because our industry is also quite addressing young people, and so maybe there is also a way to engage there. So I'm giving lots of ideas and lots of possibilities. So definitely there is work to be done for the next 5 years, and very excited about it.
There is definitely a lot, Pascal, and a lot of acronyms, as you said. Yeah, the PFAS, ESPR, WFT. Thanks for putting the link to Johanna's blog. I can confirm that it's an excellent resource. Feel free to take a look also at the Global Fashion Agenda's policy matrix, where we also list all the legislation impacting the textiles industry. And there you can even search by keyword, and then you can see where it is and where what will happen with it in the future. It's indeed hard to navigate. And some of the pieces of legislation that Pascal has mentioned will now go to the Envy Committee, right? Of which you are a member, Rasmus. So maybe for our audience who is further from Brussels, can you explain to them what happens in those committee meetings? So how do you prepare for them as an MEP? What's the flow? What's the procedure? Anything you want to share? Thank you.
Yeah, thank you. And as you could hear from Pascal, I mean, it's going to be wonderful with all the things we have to do. Luckily enough, I'm going to be busy. First, I can say a bit about how it is working in the institutions, in the committees. Of course, I mean, when legislation proposal comes from the Commission, it's being taken to the Parliament. We have to make up an opinion from the Parliament. That is being followed by, first of all, a rapporteur, which is being named in the committee. It's a negotiations between the party who gets which files. And then all the other parties appoint shadow rapporteurs, as it's called. It's people from the parties following and helping in these negotiations. So the parliament as such can have a position on the legislation, which is then going to be negotiated with the council later on. The preparation for all this, I mean, right now, I mean, of course, it's in the beginning of the mandate, and I'm spending a lot of time, first of all, looking into these guidelines. Where do I have to prepare? We are talking a lot internally in the Greens, and especially in the working groups. We have a working group of all the MEPs sitting in Envy from the Greens on how to approach the different topic there is, what is our priorities, and so forth. And then, of course, it's about meeting with organizations, businesses, people about what are the inputs. I mean, I got engaged in politics basically because I want to change the business I love so much. I mean, I love fashion. I think it's fantastic. I loved working with fabrics, and I loved my whole career. But I could also see that we're looking at an industry and which is basically an industry of the past. And I could see nothing happens if it's all up to the industry itself to change. I mean, for the last 25 years, we have seen absolutely no development whatsoever, except for in advertising. So we need the legislation, and that's what basically keep me driving, and that's why I'm meeting also a lot of people, is to say, okay, if we need to move this forward, if we take serious, I mean, and I'm going to be holding Madame von der Leyen up to this about circular economy. It's crucial, but the business actors need to get involved in as well, and that's people I talk to right now is the most ambitious, of course, because I mean we cannot wait for the rest right now.
Yeah, no, indeed. Yeah, industry of the past. That's a nice way of putting it. And we need to move ahead with the times, and we have a fantastic opportunity here to just take what worked and the elements from the previous mandate and just take this over to the new one. And yeah, something that typically happens when there's a new mandate is that there's one key advocacy tool that becomes the star, right? I'm sure many of you would guess where I'm coming to. Those are the policy manifestos. It's something that every single company or industry or association likes doing. This is basically where the organization outlines their priorities. There are many from different organizations involved in textiles related matters. I'm sure, Pascal, you have analyzed them and seen them. We've all seen them in LinkedIn and other platforms. What would you say, Pascal, are the main key common demands or points from the industry to the newly elected? Basically, what does the industry need from policymakers to transition into sustainable textiles?
Yeah, thanks. And maybe to highlight which organization I looked at for this kind of summary. I'm pretty sure I maybe missed some, but for everybody on the call to understand. So I looked into the Policy Hub for Circularity, Eurocommerce, which is like the main retailer association, EBCA, the European Brand Clothing Association, sorry. FESI, the sporting good industry. Jérôme was in the first masterclass as a speaker. And of course, Euratex was representing the European more manufacturing side of it. And what is really important is that all of them were really calling for a good, solid implementation support. Meaning, you know, like what we were discussing is there's lots in the pipeline, still some discussion. So how do we ensure that there is that level playing field that is actually set up? Meaning that all companies comply to the same rules. It's easy to understand also from a member states perspective, so that companies have the same rules wherever they make business in Sweden, Denmark, France, Italy. So same approach along the member states. And also some of them were saying still continuing the Green Deal. So I think it's a good thing. We're all going into the right direction from what Tim was saying and from Rasmus was saying. I would say it's really one of the key calls is to have clear guidelines from the Commission, really on how to implement. The clearer we have, the better it will be for SMEs that represent a big portion also of our industry, but also for the bigger organization. And also to harmonize that implementation, as I was hinting towards, to ensure all customs authorities, for example, check the same way. And there is something that has been also mentioned within Ms. von der Leyen political guidelines, is to help companies to comply with the legislation, so minimize administrative burdens. So yes, there is a change to be done, but we should not move capacity building towards just, you know, creating documents for the sake of creating documents, but actually changing the industry, to Rasmus' point, but still having, you know, the proof that you are doing the right thing. And yeah, and about trade and digital, when it comes to the twin transition, so what we call digital and green, to really put that forward together. And I think we will see that with part of the Commission's new approach and new setup. And when it comes to trade, is how to make sure the free trade agreements and approach towards third-party countries actually also ensure that the EU legislation is being reflected and supported over, you know, outside of the EU border. So that's really something that has been put forward also in all those manifestos. So Green Deal is still at the center, but also using other tools and making sure it's actually easily implementable in a summary.
Thank you, Pascal, and thanks for the gap analysis. I'm sure maybe Rasmus and Tim can also benefit from that. That sum up that gathers the main points from different organizations. And I would actually like to, of course, we cannot reach a clear answer on that, but we've been discussing a lot about, is it the implementation phase now, or is how much new is expected? So Tim already mentioned the Clean Industrial Deal, water resilience, etc. Are those expected to be legislative or not? How much of what's to come would you say, Tim, is the implementation phase, and how many more legislative files impacting the sector are to be expected?
Thanks, Maria Luisa. Yeah, I mean, I can't put a number on how many legislative proposals will come, obviously. But I think what I can do is point to what the president has been saying and what she says in her guidelines, which is really that the focus now in terms of Green Deal will be implementation. I mean, she's been pretty explicit about that. She said that the targets that we've set during this mandate, especially through to 2030, are not being called into question, and that we need to deliver on everything that we've committed to do. But the focus really now is on how you get there. And that will involve a number of things. Of course, a lot of that work will have to be done by industry, by stakeholders, by member states, in terms of national programs, regional programs for investing in the industry, for investing in the clean energy transition, these kind of things. But one thing that she has pointed out and said that she will do is to hold regular dialogues on implementation with the industry. And now I think that will probably follow a little bit the model which we've already started under this mandate with Vice President Šefčovič, where we've had these implementation dialogues. So I would not be at all surprised to see something focusing on your sector in particular in the future, or at least parts of it. So I think you will see a lot of focus from individual departments and commissioners on sitting down with industry, on understanding the bottlenecks to implementing legislation, whether that is financial obstacles, whether that is regulatory reporting burdens, whether it is helping them to train the employees that they need to develop the skill sets. So that really, I think, will be the focus of the next 5 years. We have targets which frankly we need to commit to, we need to deliver on. We already see the impact, unfortunately, of the levels of global warming that we have now. So, you know, it's got to be the priority is to make sure that we respect the targets. So you will definitely see that. I mean, the president, in her guidelines, as I mentioned, focuses a lot on competitiveness, on the strength of European industry. I mean, the first subheader in her guidelines is making business easier. So that is, I think, an important signal to you all in terms of her openness and her understanding of the need to accompany European industry in this transition. And then, yeah, there's a whole bunch of initiatives which we've already talked about, and Pascal mentioned a lot of them. Just to mention a couple of other things which I don't think got touched on yet. There's a reference in the political guidelines to e-commerce as well, to making sure that consumers and European businesses can make the most out of e-commerce, and also paying attention within that to customs, to taxation, to safety, to sustainability. So for those of you that are more on that side of the business, I think that will be of interest. And of course, artificial intelligence as well, linked to that, and the digital transition will be something which gets a lot of attention in the coming years. I think we talked about oceans, we talked about circularity. So yeah, I think I'll leave it there. Lots to come, but I think a lot of the focus will be more on delivering what we've already committed to, rather than necessarily putting a lot of new legislation on the table.
That's amazing, Tim. Thank you so much. And I guess this proves that our speakers from the first masterclass were right, even though they didn't know back then, but that's what they anticipated. And we can say now that it's true to a very large extent. But amazing that you also listed all the other topics that are to be expected, right? Because those are things that organizations need to start working on now. That's what we saw also in the previous mandate. We need to anticipate. So great that you point those out. Of course, yeah, the European Commission is an institution coming up with legislation. But I also wanted to mention in here that there are tools that the European Parliament can use for instance, to push for new initiatives. We have Rasmus here with us today, and so I would like to hear, even if again it's maybe a bit early in the mandate, but do you already have an idea on if you or your fellow ENVI committee members are planning on pushing for the introduction of new legislation impacting textiles?
I can say that it's really a focus for us, and we are a whole group within the Greens who have worked with before and who are very focused on the textile and fashion industry, because it has a huge impact, on the environment, on our nature, on our climate, and on people, especially in other parts of the world, and specifically just here in Europe. So it's really a important topic for us, and there's numbers of things, of course, we can do as parliamentarians. But basically, the first step would also be to really be focusing on it in every time we see something comes up where there is a textile view on it. And I mean, yes, there is a focus in the guidelines on now we have to follow up on all the targets we already set. But there's two important things I think I want to mention. That's first of all that Madam von der Leyen also mentioned a 90% reduction target in 2040. Which means new legislation if we're going to live up to this reduction target. And there's no climate action whatsoever if we don't touch upon the fashion and textile industry. I mean, it's a huge player when it comes to that needed action. The other thing I want to touch upon is the textile strategy, which Pascal was mentioning earlier. I mean, if you look through that, and I just read it here in my holiday again, and that's how some of us spend our holidays. It's interesting to see what we still need to do in order to live up to that, because we talk about ending fast fashion. I have not seen legislation in the last 5 years actually going to end fast fashion. On the contrary, it's actually not really moving forward for that, because we again have seen legislation that is actually focusing on good for the big businesses and more difficult for the SMEs, which normally are the more sustainable ones as well. So there's a lot to do. Tim was mentioning ocean, the big focus that is there, and I have a seat as well in the PESH committee, which is fishery, and I think it's going to be the ocean and fishery committee after this. There's a textile dimension there as well. If we're going to talk about oceans, talk about a healthy ocean and good ecosystem in the oceans, we need to talk about microplastic. It comes from the fashion textile industry as well. So the focus right now is basically to say every time something comes up and there is a perspective which plays into fashion textile industry, we're going to be there, we're going to bring it in, because again, I love this industry. I love to be part of it in all the years I have. But if I am to talk to younger generation in 10 and 20 years time and say I still love fashion, I mean, we need to act now, and we are already late. So I hope I don't hear any complaints about the few and small legislation that has been voted through in the last mandate. It's just about getting on and get it done.
Thank you so much, Rasmus, how active you are on this topic. That's great to hear. You have lots of experience from the industry as well, but you're new as a member of the European Parliament. So I am sure that you have many organizations and different stakeholders reaching out to you for meetings, etc. Would you say there's any specific input that you would particularly welcome at this stage from any of the players?
Yes, first of all, I think it's also a point we talked about before with Pascal about the industry being really immature when it comes to political advocacy work, and I can just tell you I've had two mandates in the Danish Parliament, and when you sit as an elected member of Parliament, you need input, you need to learn, and you cannot have all the knowledge with you, and you get a lot of, I mean, lobbyism is often discussed as something really bad, but also that can actually help us do better legislation. So I mean, we need good input, but the few inputs I can just tell you, and maybe it's gonna inspire some of these many people following here. I mean, the input I've got so far is, oh, don't make too much legislation now. We need time to implement, and we need to take it slow, and we need everybody to be on board. And that's not the kind of input you need.
Interesting. Thank you so much, Rasmus, and thank you so much to the three of you, because we actually made it exactly on time so that we can respect the time that we had allocated for the Q&A. I've seen that the chat has been moving a lot, and we will do our best to take as many questions as possible. All right, one question for either three of you. So just raise your hand physically and let me know. What specific legislation is promoting circularity in textile supply chains, and how should businesses prepare for these changes? That's a big one.
Happy to start. I would say when it comes to what is coming in the pipeline, the big impact on circularity will be the famous ESPR, so eco-design legislation, but also the Waste Framework Directive. And those two will really impact how you design your product and how you you recycle, also the secondary raw material market connected to waste shipment regulation. I'm going to try to stick to those three, otherwise I think I could make a link to a lot more. But really the ESPR, so eco-design legislation, is where you will have to change the design of your products at the end of that's the goal of the legislation, and to basically only accept those products that comply with those requirements on durability, recyclability, you name it, substances of concern, so chemicals. Important to note that at the moment, I cannot tell you what those requirements are, because we are in the middle of actually the definition. So you will have to wait and monitor through your, I would say, associations, the one I mentioned earlier when I did the gap analysis. So the sporting good industry, FASI, Euratex for more manufacturing, Policy Hub, EPCA, and I think I'm missing someone, sorry. Those are like the ones that we'll have to look at. When it comes to the Waste Framework Directive, it will have an impact on infrastructure within the member states on recycling and collection. And you will have, as a company, to pay a fee. So that's also, you need to budget this. Again, we don't have the details. I cannot tell you what kind of budget you need to put on the side for the taxes, but similar to what you're paying for packaging at the moment. A big point to keep in mind is that there will be a concept called eco-modulation within the Waste Framework Directive that will give you brownie points if you design really well your product. So eco-design regulation will be the baseline that you have to comply with. And then the eco-modulation will give you you will pay less fee because your product will be designed better, in a better way. So easier to recycle, easier to reuse, you name it. So that's also really important to keep this in mind and to have a big package because it will drive innovation, drive your design process, material sourcing, but also it will impact your budget, basically.
Yeah, very clear. Thank you so much, Pascal. Another interesting question. I am seriously concerned about the tsunami of bureaucracy coming from the Commission. Are we able to see any benefit for those companies who worked on sustainability for a long time? Who would like to take this one? Tim. Sure.
Yeah, the Commission is eternally under attack for the tsunami of bureaucracy which it proposes, unfortunately. Prior to this job, I spent 5 years working on the issue of better regulation as well, so it's something that I know a little bit about. And anecdotally, the Commission very regularly asks all industries, all member states, all departments to come up with lists of unnecessary regulation, which they think they can do without. And it's amazing how difficult it is for people to find concrete examples of things that they don't like. But no, I do take the point of, obviously, of this industry. We've talked about it as well, that there are a lot of new areas, new pieces of legislation which you have to deal with. I think what I can say in terms of the reassurances, as we said before, the focus is really going to be on how we implement this together. And about listening to industry's concerns to provide, whether it's guidance, whether it's financial support, these kind of conversations about adapting the implementing legislation, which is often needed to follow up these directives as well. So I would definitely say that there is a very acute awareness of the need to get the balance right between setting objectives, agreeing the fundamentals of what we need to do, and then understanding how that implements really on the bottom line, on the time that you're spending on issues like compliance. But yeah, I think there's no getting away from the fact that this is an issue which needs to be tackled with clear targets, with everybody coming together collectively. One industry, one country can't face the challenges that we have to our climate and environment alone. And there needs to be some kind of guardrails put on that. So, yeah, the legislation is not going to disappear, but I think the way that it will be implemented will be in tune with the needs of the industry.
Yeah, thank you so much, Tim, for addressing that clearly. Yes, Rasmus.
No, I think it's really an important point from Tim. This, I mean, I've also been sitting in Danish context, and people have been complaining about bureaucracy, and it's too much. And when you ask about the specifics, that it really is okay, what can we take away and still achieve the same? It's very difficult to actually get any answers. So I think the focus should be, and what I find important is actually to look out for the SMEs and look into how can we actually more help them into being able to meet what it is. Because if we want to change an industry, you need to put up specific targets, and you need to follow and control that they're being lived up to. Specifically, I mean, I'm sorry, I talked to fellow people from the business. I mean, we've seen so many times how sustainable it is when you go down in deep. It's not there. We have seen big companies saying, "Oh no, we don't use child labor," and when you go down to the details, you find out there was child labor. You've seen it so many times over and over again, and basically the bureaucracy we're talking about is also the control that actually there is a fair competition between the companies. So the ones who are actually doing the good thing don't get in unfair competition with all the ones who are just pretending to do it. So I think that the idea is the idea would be much stronger if we actually just see how can we help the small and medium-sized businesses within the industry, because there's loads of them in Europe, instead of talking about less bureaucracy, because bureaucracy is basically just to control that things are actually happening.
Yeah, absolutely, Rasmus. And I would actually love to stay with you because we have a question on how citizens, youth, and civil society can be involved on the policy and fashion framework within the EU.
Well, I mean, it's about having the dialogue with your representatives. I mean, elected representative. I mean, everybody wants to learn all the time. I don't know any colleagues I've ever met in any parliament who don't like to actually be in exchange with both businesses, civil society, with the electorate, citizens. I mean, we are here to serve. I mean, that is our basic job, and we're doing that also through a continuous dialogue. So contact us, come in with your good inputs, but always remember what is the aim of that work we're doing is about doing better. It's not about keeping business from the past.
Yeah. Very clear. Yes, Pascal.
Yeah, and also to add on to Rasmus' answer, there are some opportunities when the laws are new. You know, the European Commission have the Have Your Say page when initiatives are being published. So before basically when the Commission is thinking about a piece of legislation, that's actually how you can also provide your inputs as EU company, association, non-EU company, non-EU association, civil society, individual like you and me. So the Have Your Say page is also a good source to provide the inputs ahead of, you know, like talk to your members of the European Parliament, but if you don't have someone representing you because you're not from the EU, there are the ways such as the Have Your Say page.
Yeah, thanks so much for pointing that out, Pascal. It's indeed a specificity from the EU system. And this actually links nicely with a question that we've had between the link with other jurisdictions. So maybe this is for you, Pascal. Does the Corporate Sustainability Due Diligence Directive have the potential to influence the New York Fashion Act in the US? Would you like to take this?
That's a good one. I would say we always hope for the EU to be a front leader in sustainability, that other jurisdictions look at what the EU has done and not recreate the wheel. I've seen that in other industries, such as the electrical and electronic industry, with a piece of legislation on substances restriction. There is a ripple effect usually when the EU comes with some legislation. So I would say, yes, there is an opportunity above all. That now we see, you know, international companies building up their public affairs team in the EU, but also in the US. So there is influence. There is really a wish from industry to actually get the key learnings of what happened in the EU and provide it to the different states in the US. So it's not only the New York Fashion Act, but there are some discussion in California, for example, on extended producer responsibilities. So I can see with our clients, there is a discussion around this, how to bring the knowledge, how to bring the key learnings into other areas in the world, and also in not only retail country, as I call them, but also in production countries.
Yeah, and you actually brought up EPR, which is the topic of another question that's in there and very much at the core, because as you said, movements are expected from California in the next weeks. And the question we have is, what progress can be expected from EU extended producer responsibility? We don't have a magic ball, I'm afraid, but I don't know if you want to share any reflections on what comes to mind.
Yeah, I would say like with so under the current, maybe I do a bit of framework background for those that are not aware of where we are legislative from a legislative standpoint. There is an existing waste framework directive. We are reviewing it, and under the current legislation, all member states have the obligation to set up system by 2025. But it's not really, there is no like specific guidelines, and that's what the revision is coming through. And here the idea is really to have clear objectives with the famous eco-modulation, with the same setup, so through what we call EPOs, extended producer organizations. That is the same setup that actually the money is going into the infrastructure and creating this need for recycling industry, to also make sure that the targets under the eco-design legislation on recycled content is actually matched. So there is like a full circle here. So more to come, because as we said with Rasmus, it's under the trilogue, the final discussions, but I would say if you're a bit patient, we are hearing it's, the goal is to finalize everything in November. So let's see by the end of this year.
Yes, indeed, an exciting topic here. A lot happening also at national level from individual member states. And definitely lots of attention put into that, both at the EU level and at the global level. All right, there's a lot of interesting questions. Yes, what is the connection between e-commerce and circularity? How can we guide fashion trade to be more local focused in EU region? Any ideas inspired, any of you? Shall we move on to the next one, and then you just raise your hand if you would like to add something on that? Yeah, let's do that. Yes, Tim, this one is for you. Do you foresee the Commission taking any further action to directly tackle overproduction fast fashion in the next mandate?
Yeah, I think what you're going to see is probably a continuation of the current momentum, which means there's more media, more political attention, more consciousness related to this issue. Now, I don't know specifically what could be foreseen. I would imagine that would be within the overall framework of the work on circular economy, perhaps part of the Circular Economy Act. But I think as well, these things are subject to conversations which will happen in the coming months, at the level of the commissioners, at the level of the services, the demand from the industry, what the appetite is of Rasmus and his colleagues in the parliament to see legislation and to see new initiatives. So yeah, really, as I was saying a bit earlier, we don't have a concrete playbook for the next 5 years. What we have is a political guidelines, a clear sense of direction and priorities. And then every year the Commission presents a work program of legislation. And I think you will see a bit more clarity in the next 6 to 12 months, really, in terms of where the attention will go. The commissioners will go for hearings before the European Parliament. That's often a moment where MEPs will be extracting promises from them. So yeah, could well come up, but there's nothing more specific that I could say at this stage.
Yeah, thank you so much for that. And indeed, lots of attention put into that work program. Yes, I see Rasmus and then Pascal.
Yeah, it was just a question before. I just have to go into my head and make a U-turn so I can interesting to answer, because I mean, the complexity is how do we actually sustain an industry in Europe at the same time as making it sustainable, and that's a big revolution we have to do when it comes to fashion and textile, because it's nowhere near sustainable with the consumption as we see it right now. So how do we make legislation that actually change the whole industry, still keeping a competition fair for across the union? That's a big question. I think something we have to look into is specifically a lot of the imports coming right now from e-commerce. I mean, Shein and Temu and what they called all these different big Chinese brands selling tons of very non-sustainable clothing to Europeans. So that's another place where there is something to be done, and where I actually think the industry could play a positive role as well, is how do we actually go in and do that? Because for me, it's not about only being able to buy European in Europe, but it's about that we actually make really tough demands on our businesses here. But of course, then everybody should live up to it. And that's where some of the new tools we gotten in the last term, like the CBAM, could be a very good tool to start and implement also on the textile area.
Yeah, thank you, Rasmus. Yeah, there's a follow-up question that just entered. Can we make a law to ban shopping from such places? You mentioned the CBAM. Any other?
There is ways of doing it, but I mean, it's important to say. I mean, the industry is a global industry, even though we have a lot of local businesses and brands. But we need to make tougher demands, and when we do that to European brands, of course, we need to make them as well to people who are exporting to Europe, and specifically those two companies. There's a lot of rules about postal rules that date back to the 1800th century, Abby, where we need to go in and do something, because it's legislation made for another period, and we need to look into it's not being so cheap to send things around as we're doing right now, where people are buying a T-shirt, wear it a few times and throw it out, and it's been produced in China, sent from China, you wear it here and then just basically throw it out because the quality is so low and it was so cheap. And that's something we can also work on EU level.
Yeah, and as usual, the end arrives when it gets more interesting, right? I think we could continue here forever. Yeah, I would need to wrap up briefly, but you did have your hand raised, Pascal. Any?
Yeah, it was just to add on to Tim. Sorry for the audience, we're like back and forth. But on overproduction and overconsumption, there is one aspect, again, under the eco-design legislation on unsold goods. So there is an obligation to actually report on the unsold goods. And we always know that when it comes to reporting, there is usually something afterwards. I guess it's, might be coming up in the near future. And again, also under unsold goods, there is forbidden now to destroy unsold goods just for the textile industry. So there is this aspect that is considered when it comes to overconsumption, overproduction rather than overconsumption.
Yeah, thank you, Pascal. Actually, I have good news. The team tells me that we can maybe take one last one. It's a really good one as well. So we will do a shorter wrap up, but this is too tempting. So yeah, one last question. And I would like to hear from the three of you very, very briefly. If you had to give a few actionable pieces of advice for brands on where to start to build a good foundation to comply with regulations, where would you start from? It's not that easy to reply this shortly, but just a couple of ideas that come from the three of you. Would you like to start, Tim?
Okay, so you're making the bureaucrat give the industry advice on how to run their business. That sounds like a great way to start. No, I mean, I think the people on the other side of this camera know better than me what their industry needs to do in terms of adaptation, and that will depend a lot on the kind of the size of the company as well, the production footprint, the sales footprint where you're doing business with. What I would say, big picture thing, is look at your resources, look at circularity, look at recycling, look about really taking the maximum out of every resource that you use, whether that's your raw materials, whether that's water, whether that's the energy that you're using to drive your industry. There will be more and more opportunities to use renewable energy in the business, sustainable transport as well. We haven't touched on that very much, but that's obviously has a strong link to online shopping. So yeah, I won't tell people how to run their business. I wouldn't be well placed to do that. But I think, we share a lot of information, whatever people might say about how untransparent the Commission is. You can find what we have planned in terms of initiatives. You can find ways to get in touch with the Commission, get in touch with Rasmus, get in touch with national representatives, and ensure that you know what's coming from our side of the table, and that you provide us with as much information as possible on the needs of the business, and we try and find some middle ground and try and advance together.
We lost you in the end, Tim, but I think you were perfect. Yes, thank you for giving it a try. Indeed, that's a great answer, and great to hear that legislators can also give advice to to business. And I would love to hear also from one of the co-legislators, given that the Commission gave it a try. Rasmus, anything that comes to mind?
No, I mean, the discussion is really that I mean, we stand at a point right now where it's crucial to play in from the side of business, that we need to see that, I mean, as clear and as on point as possible.
Yeah, amazing. And Pascal, I'm sure you could go on this one forever, but maybe select one or two main messages for our.
Yeah. No, I will. I think traceability is the key one. So you have to prove you're complying. So it's one of the sentences that I usually use. And sorry for those who don't like bureaucracy, but if you don't have the data, you cannot show you're complying. So you don't have access to the EU market. So you cannot sell. It's as simply as it is. The big companies are working on traceability strategy. So that's really, really important. And that means you need to engage with your supply chain, see them as really as business partners and not as suppliers. They will be the one that you will need to comply and to sell your products on the market. So work together to find actually a traceability tool to capture data from social aspects, but also environmental aspects, because due diligence would be needed, circularity, we talked about it, energy also. So really, it's a industry effort around traceability.
Yes, thank you so much, Pascal. There was so much during this discussion. Yes, plenty of things, but let me try to wrap this up in a few points. First of all, what we hear from our panelists and then from the Commission is that there's ongoing commitments to the Green Deal, but yeah, also new political alliances will need to be put in place to pass the legislation. As we mentioned, the College of Commissioners is still to be defined. There's new portfolios created like oceans and fisheries, and in a couple of weeks we will know more about that. So let's all stay tuned to that, and I'm sure that both us at DFA and Pascal and many others will be communicating about that. Yes, there's an interesting point that Tim made about the reversed equation. So create jobs and push industry that is good for the climate. The focus remains indeed on harmonizing implementation and dialogue with the industry, but there are new topics that are to be expected with, for instance, PFAS, microplastics, water, etc. And maybe one last point is that we need to also monitor how EU legislation is being supported outside of the EU. The impact on other countries and trade is, of course, undeniable. And as Pascal just mentioned, the dialogue with the manufacturers is key. That was it on my end. Thank you so much. It has been a pleasure. thank you to our three amazing panelists, and the mic goes back to our host.
Hello again. Thank you so much for joining this this session. It has been such an interesting discussion, and thank you to the audience also for all your amazing questions. If there's, I hope you learned a lot today, but if there's anything that you missed, then this session has been recorded and will be uploaded to the Global Fashion Agenda website in a day or two. And before we close for today, I also just want to give attention to our fashion CEO agenda, which you can download via the QR code here, but also on the Global Fashion Agenda site. We published a new edition or special edition of it end of 2023 about how to operationalize these 5 priorities that we have in the Fashion CEO agenda. I also want to give a shout out to our Global Fashion Agenda newsroom on our website. This is where I encourage you to explore some of the sustainability developments going on, but also within GFA, what are some of the projects that we are working on at the moment. There's a lot of great content there, articles that you can explore. And that was all from us today. And again, thank you so much for joining. And thank you so much, Maria Luisa, for moderating, and for the speakers who joined today. I hope you all have a wonderful evening or day where you are, and I'll see you again soon.